I think there's, for quite a long time, there have been far-right groups who have been organising strongly against Muslims, and in particular arguing around issues of violence, sexual exploitation, and also connected to migration, refugee status, asylum, and so on. And so arguing that what the failure to control migration and the failure to stop the boats with asylum seekers crossing the Channel had meant that mainly Muslim men who were a threat to the British population and who were potentially violent and were terrorists coming from areas of a high degree of violence. That had been circulating a lot on social media. It played into more mainstream arguments, which said that some Muslims lived segregated lives and separate from the wider British community. So this argument about Muslims not fitting in with so-called British values has been a major theme, and it's been a feature of tabloid newspapers, particularly around Stop the Boats. Then it coincided with the election, and of course the Reform Party had some of those themes as well. So there had been quite an atmosphere as a consequence of the election, I think, as well, of reinforcing those themes. And then if one would call it from their perspective, the disappointing performance of the Reform Party in getting very few seats, but somehow getting a significant number of voters. That, I think, contributed to the atmosphere. But the theme of predatory behaviour by Muslim males has been quite a long-standing theme of the far right and of particular figures on social media. So when you get in events like the very tragic event that happened in Southport, and of course part of the process of a police investigation is to not to release any information about the event, just say things like an individual has been arrested or detained and so on, and not giving any information about the circumstances of that detention. That creates a space in which various social media channels can speculate and so on. And so that, I think, is the set of circumstances that were playing out. So you have fertile ground, a very tragic and significant event, and then the social media conspiracies around that. I think the thing that's quite surprising is that it is not as young as you would imagine. So if you make the comparison to the 2011 riots, then that was mainly sort of young people, teenagers, early 20s and so on. In the violent disorder that has been associated with the actions in the last week, I hesitate to call them riots, because they weren't something that just kind of happened as disturbances and people joining in. They were focused and directed at specific targets, at the homes of Muslim families, at mosques, at hotels with asylum seekers. And it was mainly people, men and women too, at the ages of 30, 40, 50, even up to sort of pension age. So it was quite significant. Obviously, there are young people involved, and you could see in the pictures sort of youngsters circling around on BMX bikes and so on. But that was not the main instigators of the action. They were significantly older, 30s, 40s, 50s. And I think there's a kind of connection with football hooliganism in the sense that the English Defence League, which is something like the profile, I mean, English Defence League has faded in the last few years, but its kind of structure of being organised around, men at football matches and so on, that's an older demographic too. So I think that loose sort of organisation was part of the memory of some communities of how things were organised during the when EDL was at its height. And so that's why I think too that the activities and actions were dispersed across the sorts of places that had had previous actions of this sort, and it was focused on the social media activities of people like Andrew Tate, Tommy Robinson involved in the EDL. So I think it's not young men, it's fathers, if we put it in those terms. So it's a much more serious and profound issue than, say, the 2011 riots. Not really, but it would seem to be a working class demographic, sort of working class, and in a sense, you have to think of the sort of people who are able to take part in those activities, people involved in self-employed trades and so on. That so not people who are, in a sense, putting their employment on a line because they are involved in a different kind of, let's call it a grey economy, if you like, and where the people they're working with are not unsympathetic either to what they're doing. I don't think the mainstream media, so much more social media recycling conspiracies. So in that sense, the mainstream media would have known more of the facts than they were providing, because they are constrained by court processes and contempt of court action. So the police will not wish them to give the name, identity, age of the person committing an offence. And particularly in this case, it was somebody just before their 18th birthday, so they would be, in a sense, have the protections of a child and a young person in that context. So I don't think the mainstream media is in any way responsible, except for how it fueled the general discourse about stop the boats, the general discourse about the problem of Muslims not fitting in and so on. So I think there's a high degree of culpability of the mainstream media in how it has misrepresented and misreported British Muslims. Let's actually say Muslims in England, because in a way it was noticeable that Scotland was not part of there were none of these problematic events in Scotland, mainly in England and partly in Wales as well. So I think it's an English phenomenon. I think it's a phenomenon associated with the English press, the English media, tabloid media, and so on. But I don't think they had that any direct culpability. And what is very noticeable is newspapers like the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, has very strongly come out against the disorder and very strongly following last night's counter demonstrations and so on come out in support of the counter demonstrations. And so it's quite surprising that they obviously feel that that there's not the sort of latent support that they might have imagined. I think there was a survey just done that found that, looking at voters of different political parties, and that nearly all voters in the mainstream parties were thoroughly hostile to the disorder, with the exception of voters for the Reform Party, where about 30% of their voters in this particular survey indicated that they thought it was the disorder was justified. So I think there is a sense in the mainstream right-wing press that, that this was a moment and they have moved back towards the centre rather than wanting to appear to be suggesting that there was a legitimate underlying reason, even though they have been fueling it in the past, I think. I think there's been the cryptic support is is one that says, well, this disorder is completely wrong. There's no justification for it, but we have to understand there's a legitimate concern, and that people have not been able to speak about the legitimate concern about too high levels of immigration and the changing. Let's say the changing face of Britain. Of course, we've heard nothing but arguments about the problem of immigration and the changing face of Britain. So the idea that these views have been silenced and have not been allowed to be expressed is a very strange one, because they're being expressed all the time, and we've just had an election in which they were expressed. And so one might say, well, actually, the widespread expression of these views in the election was part of the problem. It's not that they were these legitimate concerns haven't been addressed, but the people who have these concerns haven't liked the fact that the rest of the population, actually voted out of office the Conservative Party that had been expressing the concern. So I think that's also part of the context, what one might call the disappointment with the result of the election by certain Conservative figures. And because we've got a Conservative leadership contest going on, you can see that some of those candidates or some of those who thought they might be candidates for the leadership had been leaning towards the Reform UK and suggesting that Nigel Farage should be, that they should merge with the Conservatives and so on. So there is a sort of redrawing of the right taking place, and I think that's what's happened. And so for many of us, it's been hard to hear any other view than the view of stop the boats, immigration, etc. And yet that's the discourse that the much of the mainstream press has put forward. I wouldn't have said within the Conservative Party. So I think it's that dangerous unwillingness to challenge your own electorate in the darker aspects of their views. So of not wishing to, in a sense, lead is the problem. So I think it would be difficult to say that the Conservative Party was fascist. I think there is a worrying degree of fascism otherwise. And of course, the nature of what these disturbances were is, they're not protests that got out of control. They were actions which were specifically directed towards having the violent ends that were set out. So people did go with sticks, did go to with throwing bricks and so on. That was part of what the event was, not something that happened because things got out of control. They were directed towards that. And I think it's reasonable to call that fascistic in its use of violence and its use of intimidation and its design to scare people who are fellow citizens and who are legitimate in their activities. So the attacks on ethnic minority businesses, the attacks on mosques and so on, I think those are deeply worrying. I think it's very hard to separate them because the refugee crisis is associated with Syria, Syrian refugees, and is associated with refugees from Muslim majority countries. So you won't hear anybody talking about, well, part of the problem is we've taken in too many refugees from Ukraine. I mean, partly we haven't, but you won't hear a discourse about Ukraine of that sort. So I think it's Islamophobic, and because you can represent the so-called refugee crisis as a failure of the government to stop the boats, it becomes a way of talking about Muslims, and it's a way of being Islamophobic without having, whilst saying, oh, well, but of course everybody sees as a legitimate concern. The government believes the borders should be controlled and so on. So it becomes how an essentially Islamophobic discourse can be unfurled without it being named straightforwardly as that. But of course, when you see the disorder and how it's directed, you see it has very specific Islamophobic character. I think prevent is problematic in all sorts of ways. So I wouldn't like to argue that prevent should be directed towards the far right, or I think there is a problem of prevent in itself, because what it does is inflate and magnify things which are of a very minor concern. So prevent is, although it's supposed to be directed towards radicalization, it's directed at forms of extremism, all of which are perfectly lawful. So you would have a concern if somebody in the population said, well, what you describe as extreme are my lawfully held views. Why am I not allowed to speak them? So prevent itself creates that sense that people are being silenced or their views can't be heard. The paradox of prevent is it says, well, there's it identifies something called fundamental British values, and then it says that there are people who live segregated lives and live outside these fundamental British values. And by calling them British, it in effect directs attention towards ethnic minorities and people who are imagined to have a cultural or a religious deficit from the point of view of those values. So when you think of the right wing, it's individualized. When you think of the issue of Muslims, it's seen to be a problem of the community. And what I think this violent disorder shows is that there is a problem of the values of members of British communities, of British white communities. They are not, they are living outside what's called mainstream British values. And all the sociological evidence, the surveys, show that British Muslims are, are the closest group to the population as a whole. They are the most mainstream group, and yet they called as if they are outside those values. And if one sees it in class terms, I feel what I'm going to say might be regarded as slightly dubious here, but if what you say is, well, a lot of British Muslims, by virtue of their religious commitments and so on, are fairly conservative in their attitudes. They're conservative towards issues of the family. That means conservative also towards issues of self-reliance and so on, and conservative in terms of being a group with a high degree of religiosity and commitment to the practice of the religion, attending mosque and so on. So they are British conservatives. But British conservatives don't recognise them as conservative, crudely because they're brown. And then the problem on the other side is British liberals find there's a problem of the conservative, find the conservatism as an issue. So they're sort of caught between things. And by virtue of the class position of Muslim ethnic minorities, they tend to live in areas of low socioeconomic characteristics and so on. So they live not by the side of middle-class British people to whom they have a greater resemblance in terms of values, but next to British white working class, which is probably more divergent in terms of values. So if you go, for example, to a Muslim area of Birmingham, you won't find very many pubs. So the thing that characterizes sociability in the white working class, going to pubs, is not the characteristic of Muslim population. So they can appear segregated from the communities within which they're immediately living at the same time as they have the values of the wider population. So I think that's part of the issue. So the where the issues of racism come in is that accusation of British Muslims as not fitting in is resonant both with middle class and with working class native populations, and yet all the studies show they fit in. They do jobs, they run businesses, they run restaurants, they attend local community event and so on. So I think there's what Prevent does is other Muslims, when it could be, say, well, if you wish to stop radicalization, then religiosity is not the problem, it's the answer. Young people going to mosque is the answer, not, and if I said, well, what will we do about young people caught up in these disturbances, young white people caught up in these disturbances? What do you say? They should go to the local Methodist Church Youth Club? They should, those community networks have broken down, and also austerity has undermined the local council providing services for young people. So paradoxically, what's called the segregation of Muslim communities is their resilience. It's a source of strength and ability of them to sort of engage, but the government wishes to keep them at arm's length, and that's, I think, a problem. And that's the new Labour government, I think, as well as the Conservative government, or the new Labour government hasn't shown that it's going to act differently. I mean, just say one last thing. If synagogues had been attacked in the way that mosques had been attacked, a British Prime Minister would have been at the synagogue. But they haven't been, the British Prime Minister hasn't been at mosques standing with Muslim community. So I think there are very subliminal messages which are given, which show the discomfort of the political class, if one puts it that way. One of the problems is that under the Conservative government, which has moved to the right, I don't say it's moved to the far right, but it's moved into a space where, if you think of these overlapping circles where members of the far right are occupying the same space on some issues as members of the government. So replacement theory is regarded as a legitimate view within mainstream right-wing circles, and it's not simply a discourse of the far right, although it is also, of course, a discourse of the far right. So what has happened is that if you are following the logic of prevent, and since prevent is about stopping people moving further across that, you would have to be tackling right-wing ideas that are in that overlapping space. But that's been really embarrassing to the government. So what it has done is said, no, prevent should be more focused on Muslims, more focused on political Islam, and it's over-focused on the far right. But it's failed to see that what it's done is its own measures in expanding the area of terrorism legislation has both has pushed back the area of extremism with which you're concerned, and has also brought far more right-wing young people into the definition of being terrorist. Because if you have, in my view, a lot of the recent terrorism offences, non-violent terrorism offences of downloading material off the internet, and I'm not talking about downloading material off the dark web, I'm talking about downloading material which is legitimately posted in a jurisdiction like the United States, which is easily accessible for Anglophone young people, but is against the law in Britain. And it's not simply against the law, it's against the worst sort of laws, that is, it's against terrorism laws. So you suddenly have 16, 17-year-olds apparently committing terrorism offences, and all they're doing is sitting in their bedroom downloading material. They tend to be right-wing, because that's how, if you like, the right wing is organised. So, and so at the same time as the government is saying, well, we need these new offences, we expand these new offences, we need to focus on extremism before it gets to the committing of offences. What you're doing is bringing more right-wing people into to focus, which is why my view is that we need to start again with our views on terrorism legislation. We need to reduce the number of offences. The answer isn't to lock up young right-wing people. The answer is, better education within schools, and education outside the context of labelling people's actions and ideas and behaviour as risky to the public. Just say, well, let's allow teachers to exercise their professional role in educating pupils better rather than reporting them under prevent, bringing a counter-terrorism officer in, and so on. So I think we've got, that's part of the thing that I would hope comes out of this period, is that we don't say, well, oh, look, the right wing is a far bigger problem, so we have to do more against them. That, well, let's do less against it. Let's actually have more discussion, more dialogue, more people meeting each other. I mean, one of the most resonant pictures in the disturbances was a mosque in Newcastle where there were protesters outside, and the mosque came out with burgers and chips from their kitchen and gave them to the people protesting and said, well, look, you've been standing around not eating, here's some food. Why don't you sometime come back and talk to us, find out who we are? And so I think that's, politics has wanted to make difference a problem rather than make difference something that people engage with and appreciate and understand. I think it shows a failure of the system. It's not a failure of multiculturalism, it's a failure to properly implement multiculturalism. I mean, Britain differs from France because we don't have the same kind of secular institutions. And because we don't have secular institutions, we have to recognize the religious rights of others. So I accept that we are, in that sense, more multicultural than France. A lot of liberal people in Britain are anti-religion, so they don't like they don't like accepting the and recognizing fully the religious rights of others and the rights to religious expression in the public sphere. But I think that's what the problem has been. Liberals in England have seen that one of the consequences of the increased proportion of ethnic minorities is an increasing role of minority religions, and that whereas within the white population, Christian observance has declined, which is positive from a secular perspective. This is all in heavy inverted commas. What they've discovered is that there's an increasing proportion of children in our schools who are from religious backgrounds, and they are minority religious backgrounds, and they have rights to the expression of those views within schools. So I think that's positive, and I think we should embrace it. So I think France could learn from British multiculturalism, but what it could learn from British multiculturalism is that you need to be more thoroughgoing with it. You need to say, well, all these communities with different forms of religious expression are, in a sense, communities that are in your country as a consequence of processes of colonialism, whether that's French colonialism or British colonialism, that we had no problem of multiculturalism when we were running empires and when the system was one of hierarchical relationships. The problem that France and Britain has to learn is multicultural equality. That is what it is to treat others as having an equal right to say that they are citizens and that they represent what citizens are. So I think there is something to learn there. But if you take the lesson, well, let's push away from multiculturalism and go towards an argument for assimilation, it will necessarily fail. And it should fail, that assimilation is not, it's a bit like saying that I will accept somebody else so long as their voice is similar to mine. And what that means is if their voice is similar to mine, I don't have to listen to it because I already know what my voice is. So what we need to do is much more listening, much more engagement, and much more respecting of the rights of others. That's France or Britain. So, and I think we're close to being, in a sense, moving closer to France. And I think that would be a mistake. And I think France would be better if we both moved in the other direction. And take the message of, I think the message of Brexit is that as well. The reason why Britain didn't like Brexit is that it was used to being a dominant partner or a dominant member of an empire and a commonwealth. It didn't like the Commonwealth once it had to be equal with others. It went into the European Union and, oh my word, we're one amongst others as equals. We don't like that. Let's step out. So I think there's a sort of arrogance of Europeans, an arrogance of British, and dare I say it, an arrogance of the French towards that aspect of recognising others as equal. Well, I do hope they will come to an end. I'm not sure that they will. Most disorder of the kind that we've had in the past, I've frequently said, we seem to get riots in Britain every 10 years. So 2001, 2011, 2024, delayed by COVID. I mean, but the cycle is there. But I think this is different, and those kinds of riots, because they don't have a particular political purpose, because they're a symptom, they blow out, and then people can get back together to try and put things right again. This may not be like that, simply because they're different from the previous cycles of disturbances. They are politically directed at minority communities in Britain. So in that sense, they are relatively controlled rather than being a sort of Durkheimian malodorous effervescence. I mean, they are. There's a politics to them which I think is worrying, and that partly is what is being promoted through social media and characters like Elon Musk and so on. So I think that's the worry that we have to consider, and that I think is the worry that may be in France. That let's say, well, there's something different about this, and it's because Britain, we were, because of our national character to be self-congratulatory, we were congratulating ourselves on not being right-wing, like the rest of Europe. We had held the line and was moving backwards. We've just had a very rude awakening from that sense of ourselves.